The fog clung to the streets of Paris, its damp fingers creeping through narrow alleys and swirling around lampposts like ghosts of forgotten pasts. In the middle of it all, a solitary figure stood, half hidden by the shadows of the Quai des Orfèvres. Inspector Jules-Aimé Maigret, a man whose mind had unravelled the most tangled of mysteries, now found himself confronting an enigma unlike any other. No witnesses, no obvious motives, only a strange illness that had swept through the city, stealing lives with no clear cause. But this was Paris, and in the heart of this city, nothing was as simple as it seemed. Before the ink had even dried on the report, Maigret knew. The truth, buried beneath layers of suspicion and half-truths, was waiting for him to uncover. But who could he trust when even the most innocent of faces seemed to conceal secrets? Before you continue, make sure you've liked, shared, and subscribed for more tales from the heart of Paris, where every shadow hides a story and every whisper tells a secret. The first cases appeared on a Tuesday morning, when the grey mist still hung low over the city, and the bells of Saint-Sulpice sounded dull and tired in the damp air. Paris was waking slowly, half dreaming still, when the news spread through the narrow streets like a whisper of bad weather. An old bookseller from Rue du Cherche-Midi had collapsed behind his counter, his face pale as the pages of his stock, his eyes wide open, yet strangely empty. By midday, 3 more had fallen, a seamstress near the Boulevard Saint-Germain, a young student from the École des Mines, and a retired postman who had been seen just an hour before drinking coffee at the Café du Métro. There was no pattern, no shared address, no common meal or gathering, only the same strange, rapid decline, a fever, a dizziness, a brief paralysis, and then silence. At first, the newspapers dismissed it as a rumour. A passing malady, they wrote, brought by the change of season. The doctors, more cautious, called it a peculiar infection. But in the smoke-filled office of the Quai des Orfèvres, where Inspector Maigret sat behind his heavy desk, the matter felt heavier than that. The reports arriving on his desk were written by men who rarely exaggerated. There was a tone in their writing, that quiet note of unease which Maigret had learned to recognize as the first sign that something was not right. He sat with his pipe between his teeth, his elbows resting on the blotter, eyes narrowed in thought. The rain tapped gently against the window pane. Lucas entered quietly, his hat in hand, his coat damp. "Another one, Chief," he said. "Rue Bonaparte this time, a young woman, mid-30s, same symptoms." Maigret took the report, glanced through it, and exhaled slowly. No connection? None that we can see. Different neighborhoods, different circles. It's like the illness chooses at random, Maigret finished for him. He rose from his chair and looked out into the courtyard below, where puddles reflected the faint glow of the lamps. The fog was thickening, swallowing the outlines of the opposite building. "Fetch Janvier," he said finally, "and tell Dr. Pardon I'll be at his office before noon." By the time Maigret stepped outside, the city had taken on that peculiar hush that comes before something important, when even the horses seemed to clatter more softly on the cobblestones. He pulled his coat tighter and began to walk, his breath visible in the cold air. There was no wind, only the slow drifting of mist and the smell of rain-soaked stone. The cafes were half empty, the usual chatter subdued. Paris, it seemed, was holding its breath. At Pardon's surgery, the doctor greeted him with his usual warmth, but his face was drawn. "You've come about the illness, haven't you?" he said, pouring them both a small glass of brandy. "I've seen 3 patients myself. Same symptoms, no common cause. It's not influenza, it's not poisoning, and it's not hysteria." "What do you suspect?" Maigret asked. Pardon sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know, but it's as though something is attacking the nerves directly. The body simply shuts down. It's uncanny. The inspector nodded, absorbing every word. And the victims? Do they have anything in common? Their habits, their diet? Nothing, said Pardon. Different ages, professions, neighborhoods. The only similarity is the look in their eyes before they lose consciousness, as if they've seen something they cannot explain. Maigret left the surgery with the rain beginning to fall in earnest, small silver threads tracing the contours of his coat. He walked aimlessly for a time, through streets whose names he'd known all his life, past the tobacconist where he bought his pipes, past the baker who always called him commissaire with a smile, until he found himself standing on the Pont Neuf, staring at the Seine. The river moved darkly beneath him, slow and endless. He leaned on the railing, letting the cool air clear his thoughts. Somewhere behind him a newspaper boy shouted headlines, "Mysterious illness spreads, city on edge." That night, back at the quay, the files piled higher. 5 more names by midnight. Maigret sat long after the others had gone home, the lamps burning low. He felt an unease he couldn't quite define, not fear, but the knowledge that something unseen was working its way through the city, silent and deliberate. He imagined it moving from one apartment to the next, slipping past curtains and closed shutters, invisible yet unstoppable. Madame Maigret had left supper waiting for him when he returned home, but he barely touched it. She watched him quietly, her knitting idle in her lap. "It's bad, isn't it?" she asked softly. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Yes, and I don't yet know why." The next morning, a telegram arrived from the provincial prefecture in Tours. A similar illness had been reported there, 2 deaths in a single night. Maigret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The sickness was spreading beyond Paris. He lit his pipe, the first of many that day, and stared at the telegram until the words seemed to blur. When Lucas entered with fresh coffee, Maigret finally spoke. "Have someone check every case for common purchases in the last week? Chemists, grocers, markets, anything consumable, and send Janvier to speak with the families, quietly. I don't want panic." The day wore on. The sound of typewriters echoed in the corridors, mingling with the muffled rumble of carriages outside. By evening, a thin file had formed on his desk. Details from each victim, meticulously written, yet offering no link. Different professions, different ages, even different arrondissements. It was like chasing smoke. Maigret sat back, eyes half closed, and let his mind wander through the labyrinth of the city, its narrow stairwells, its damp courtyards, its rows of identical windows, behind which every life was a mystery of its own. He thought of the young woman on Rue Bonaparte, the student from the École des Mines, the old bookseller who had sold him novels once upon a time. Somewhere among them was a thread. He simply had to find it. Then came the knock. Lucas again, hat in hand, face pale. "Chief, there's something you'll want to see. The woman from Rue Bonaparte, her landlord, just found something in her room." Maigret rose slowly, his coat already in hand. "What is it?" Lucas hesitated. "A small vial, empty, no label." Outside, the fog had thickened once more, curling around the street lamps like pale smoke. As the 2 men walked toward Rue Bonaparte, the sound of their footsteps echoed hollowly on the stones. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. Maigret said nothing, but in his mind the case was already shifting, taking on a darker shape. An illness that struck without warning was one thing. A vial. That was something else entirely. The rain began again, soft at first, then steady. And Paris, that ancient city of whispers and secrets, seemed to close in around him as though listening. The rain had ceased by morning, but the streets still glistened like sheets of dull metal under the pale sun. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and coffee grounds. From the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, the city looked deceptively calm. Below, market vendors set up their stalls, their voices drifting faintly upward. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of Paris, something uneasy pulsed, a tremor that only those who watched closely could sense. Maigret stood by the window, pipe unlit, staring into the distance. He had not slept well. The image of the empty vial found in the woman's room returned to him again and again through the night. It was small, clear glass, no larger than a man's thumb, its stopper missing. The chemists had found no residue, no trace of poison or narcotic. It was, as far as science could tell, simply empty, and yet he knew it was not nothing. When Lucas entered with his usual brisk step, the inspector turned slowly. "Did you speak to the neighbours?" "Yes," Lucas said, placing his notes on the desk. They heard nothing. The woman, Madame Arnaud, kept to herself, a widow, modest pension, no visitors, except for one man seen twice last week. Elderly, quiet. No one knew his name. Maigret nodded. And the vial? Bought from an apothecary on Rue des Martyrs. Sold as part of a set for perfume or medicine. Nothing illegal. The inspector filled his pipe thoughtfully, then motioned toward the door. "Come, we'll visit Rue des Martyrs ourselves." The apothecary was a narrow shop with a bell that tinkled faintly when they entered. Glass jars lined the shelves like silent sentinels, each containing powders or liquids in varying shades of amber and green. The owner, a thin man with nervous eyes, adjusted his spectacles as Maigret showed the vial. "Yes, yes," the man said quickly. "I sell dozens like this, very popular among women who make their own scents. This one, see the lip? Slightly cracked. Sold it last week to an older woman, if I recall. Paid in cash. No name." "Describe her," Maigret said quietly. "Short, grey hair, dark shawl. She smelled faintly of lavender soap. Nothing remarkable." Maigret glanced at Lucas. Lavender soap, a detail that might mean nothing or everything. Outside, the street was busy again. The clouds had broken, and light filtered down between the buildings, glinting off the puddles. Maigret stood still, the vial heavy in his coat pocket. "Find her," he said. "An older woman, lavender soap. Start with the districts near the river. Someone will have noticed her." By evening, Lucas returned with news. "We found her, Chief, or someone who matches. Madame Leclerc, Rue Saint-Dominique, lives alone, widow of a railway clerk." Maigret rose. "Let's go." Madame Leclerc's apartment was small and tidy, smelling faintly of boiled potatoes and old lace. She greeted them with the cautious politeness of one accustomed to authority, but unafraid. Her eyes were sharp, her posture straight, despite her age. "Madame," Maigret said gently, "we're investigating the illness that's been troubling Paris. I understand you may have seen something unusual." She nodded slowly. "Yes, monsieur. I've told the police already, but perhaps they did not believe me." "Tell me again," Maigret said. She motioned for them to sit, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It was last Thursday night, near midnight. I couldn't sleep. My cat had run out onto the landing. I went to fetch him, and through the window I saw a man standing by the street lamp opposite. He was watching the building across the road, where the young widow lived. The air was full of fog, but I could see his outline clearly. He didn't move for several minutes, just stood there. Then he took something from his coat, a small object, maybe a bottle, and placed it on the step. After that he walked away, quietly, like a shadow. Maigret leaned forward. "Did you see his face?" "No," she said softly. "Only that he wore a dark hat and gloves, and his gait. It was strange, stiff, deliberate, as if each step cost him effort." "Did you tell anyone?" "I mentioned it to the concierge the next day, but she said I'd been dreaming. Yet when I went to look, the step was clean, as if someone had already taken whatever he'd left." Maigret nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, madam. You've been very helpful." As they stepped back into the stairwell, Lucas whispered, "You believe her?" "Every word," Maigret murmured. "A woman like that doesn't imagine shadows." They stood outside for a moment, the cold seeping through their coats. "It's him," Maigret said finally. "The man who moves through this city leaving no trace. We'll find him again. We always do." Later that night, back at the quay, Maigret sat alone. The corridors were silent, except for the faint hum of the street beyond. He lit his pipe and stared at the ceiling. In his mind, he could see the man, the way he stood beneath the lamp, the fog swirling about him, the vial glinting faintly in his hand. Whoever he wasn't random. He had purpose. And that purpose was what frightened Maigret most. He thought of the victims, of the empty rooms and the frightened faces left behind. A pattern was forming, though faintly, like writing beneath too many layers of ink. He took a deep breath, exhaled smoke, and whispered to himself, "There's always someone who sees, always a silent witness." As the night deepened, the fog returned, curling around the lamps of the Pont Neuf like ghostly hands. Somewhere in the city, perhaps not far from where Maigret sat, another vial waited on another doorstep, gleaming faintly in the dark. And though Paris slept, its dreams were uneasy. 2 days later, Paris awoke beneath a ceiling of low grey clouds, the kind that turned the river into liquid steel and made every street lamp glow like a small moon. The illness had continued its quiet march. Another victim in Montparnasse, a clerk in Belleville, and a baker's assistant who had collapsed in front of her oven at dawn. The newspapers had finally given the plague a name, La Maladie du Silence. They printed lurid sketches of masked doctors and frightened mothers, as though the drawings themselves might keep the fear at bay. Maigret read none of it. The headlines annoyed him. They turned tragedy into entertainment. Instead, he sat in his office, pipe resting cold in the ashtray, staring at the thin file on his desk. Inside were the notes from every victim, every witness, every clue that led nowhere. Yet there, between the lines, he sensed something, a faint outline of logic that refused to fully show itself. At 9:30, the door opened. Janvier entered, raincoat dripping, hat in hand. "You'd better come, Chief," he said. "We've found someone. Alive, but barely." The man lay in a narrow bed at the Hôtel du Midi, his body wrapped in a blanket, though the room was warm. His eyes darted between the shadows and the window, where the blinds trembled in the light wind. He was thin, gaunt, his hair matted against his forehead. On the table beside him lay a small leather wallet, empty, and a single folded paper, blank except for a faint watermark. Maigret stood over him in silence. The man looked up, his lips moving soundlessly before a whisper escaped. "Who am I?" That question, spoken with such childlike confusion, struck Maigret harder than he expected. "You don't remember your name?" he asked, gently. The man shook his head weakly. I woke by the river. There was fog. My hands were trembling. I thought I was dead." "Did you see anyone?" "A shadow," he murmured. "A man with gloves. He gave me something to drink." "What was it?" "I don't know. It burned my throat. After that, Nothing. Maigret exchanged a glance with Janvier. The description fit too neatly. The gloves, the silence, the presence of that unseen figure Madame Leclerc had described. The inspector bent closer. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Do you remember where by the river? Left bank or right?" The man's eyes fluttered shut. "The steps, near the Pont de la Tournelle. I remember the sound of bells." Maigret straightened, the pieces turning in his mind like gears. "Janvier, have a carriage ready. We're going there." Outside, the day had turned colder. The wind off the Seine carried the smell of wet iron and soot. The Pont de la Tournelle rose ahead, graceful yet grim, its stone arches darkened by damp. They descended the steps to the riverbank. The mud was soft beneath their boots, scattered with driftwood and scraps of paper. It was there, half buried near the edge, that Maigret found it, another vial glinting faintly beneath the silt. He crouched, brushing away the dirt, and held it up to the light. Empty again, but this one bore a faint trace of something on its lip, a residue like smoke, fine and black. He slipped it into his pocket. "Send this to the lab," he said to Janvier. "Tell them to test for any substance that burns when swallowed." They climbed the steps in silence. Behind them, the water moved slow and heavy, as though carrying the city's secrets downstream. That evening, Maigret visited the hospital where the nameless man had been taken. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and candle wax. Nurses moved quietly between the rooms, their white shoes whispering on the tiles. When he entered, the man was awake, staring out the window. The sky beyond was turning the color of lead. "Do you remember anything more?" Maigret asked. The man hesitated. "A voice," he said finally. "Soft, calm," he said. "You won't remember me, that's the point." "And what did he look like?" I can't recall, only that he smiled, as if he pitied me." A long silence followed. Maigret watched the man's trembling hands, the faint blue veins under his skin. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "Rest. We'll find out who he was." But as he left the ward, he couldn't shake the feeling that safety was a fragile illusion. Something about the man's emptiness, his erased identity, felt deliberate, as though someone had scrubbed his existence clean. At the quay, Lucas was waiting with the lab results. "The residue on the vial, Chief. It's carbonized. Comes from something organic, possibly the remains of a burnt extract." "Extract of what?" "They can't say. Nothing they've seen before. It reacts strangely with water. Evaporates instantly." Maigret nodded slowly, staring at the river through the office window. The reflection of the lamps shimmered across the surface, trembling like feverish eyes. A burnt extract, a nameless man, an illness that left no trace, all parts of a single pattern, as precise as clockwork. He thought of Madame Leclerc again, her steady voice describing the man under the street lamp. Gloves, a deliberate gait, the same calm she had sensed in him, the same calm his victim described before losing memory. Maigret drew on his pipe. The smoke curled around his head, forming faint rings that drifted toward the ceiling. "Who are you?" he murmured, not to himself, but to the phantom that seemed to be walking Paris at night, unseen and untouchable. Outside, the rain began again, pattering softly against the glass. Somewhere far off, a bell struck 10. The inspector did not move. He simply watched the city through the veil of smoke, his reflection faint in the window. A solitary figure, locked in a silent duel with the unseen. And far away, perhaps on another street, beneath another lamp, a man with gloves paused for a moment, looking back toward the river, as if sensing that his invisible game was no longer secret. By the end of the week, Paris had begun to whisper in panic. The cafes still served their morning coffee, but conversations had shifted. Laughter was quieter now. Eyes darted more quickly toward the street. People spoke of neighbors who had fallen ill overnight, of families leaving the city under false names, of doctors who refused to visit their patients. The newspapers printed words like plague and curse, though the prefecture had forbidden them. It didn't matter. Fear had already taken root, and it moved faster than truth. Maigret stood in the courtyard of the Quai des Orfèvres, his coat collar turned up against the wind. The sky was the color of pewter, heavy with unfallen rain. A delivery boy cycled past, scattering pigeons. Somewhere a bell rang. He felt the rhythm of the city around him, that slow, tired heartbeat of Paris, and sensed how close it was to breaking. Inside, the police were overwhelmed. Telephones rang without pause. Reports came in from every arrondissement, most of them contradictory. Lucas had spent the night sorting testimonies that blurred into one another, 1,000 fragments of fear that made no coherent picture. Janvier's eyes were bloodshot, his voice hoarse. "Chief, we can't keep up," he said. "It's spreading faster than we can track." Maigret didn't answer. He had stopped believing in numbers. Illnesses had no regard for arithmetic. What he needed was not statistics, but the shape of a mind, the hand behind the chaos. He went to see Dr. Pardon again. The doctor looked even more exhausted than before. His waiting room was full. The smell of disinfectant couldn't hide the scent of sweat and fear. "You're not here as a patient, I hope?" Pardon said, forcing a smile. "Not yet," Maigret replied, sitting down. "Tell me, is it possible for a man to induce paralysis without poison? To silence a body but not kill it?" Pardon frowned. "You're speaking of hypnosis or trauma?" "Neither. Something physical but subtle. Something that leaves no trace." The doctor rubbed his chin. "If such a thing exists, it's beyond what science can prove. But—" he hesitated. "You remember that chemist who helped us in the Rue Le Mans case, Vasseur? He's been experimenting with compounds that affect the nervous system. Harmless in small doses, but in larger— well, he said they cause temporary paralysis, sometimes memory loss. It was never made public. The ministry shut him down." "Where is he now?" "Disappeared 3 years ago." Maigret nodded slowly. He could feel the air tightening around the case, invisible threads drawing together. "Thank you, old friend," he said, rising. "You've helped more than you know." Outside, the fog was thicker than ever, rolling down from the river in heavy folds. The city had become a theatre of shadows. From every doorway came a half-heard whisper. From every alley, the echo of unseen footsteps. The inspector lit his pipe and walked without hurry, letting instinct guide him. His route took him past the cafes of Saint-Michel, past bookshops and shuttered stalls, until he reached a small square where the wind barely stirred. There he stopped. A figure stood by the fountain, tall, motionless, hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, Maigret thought it was a statue. Then the man turned. His face was pale, angular, the eyes calm in a way that made Maigret uneasy. "You're Maigret," the man said. His voice was quiet, precise. "I've been expecting you." "Have you?" Maigret replied. "And who might you be?" The stranger smiled faintly. "No, one of consequence. A scientist once, perhaps. A fool, always." Maigret felt the weight of the revolver in his pocket, though he made no move toward it. "Vasseur," he said softly. The man inclined his head. "Once upon a time." They stood in silence, the fountain murmuring between them. "I didn't kill anyone," Vasseur said finally. "Not directly. I was looking for something. A cure, not a curse. The ministry took my notes, my funding. They left me with nothing but failure, so I tested what I had left. On volunteers at first, then on those who wouldn't be missed. Maigray's jaw tightened. And the illness? Not illness, reaction, the body's refusal to live when the mind is stripped of memory. I thought I could erase pain. Instead, I erased being. You released it on the city? Vasseur's gaze drifted toward the mist. No, others did. They saw profit where I saw regret. Before Maigret could answer, a voice called from behind. Lucas, running, his coat flapping. Chief, he's not alone. Too late. The sound of an engine roared from the alley, and Vasseur turned sharply, eyes wide. A black car slid from the fog, lights off. Shots cracked through the air, sharp and final. Vasseur staggered once, twice, then fell against the fountain. The car vanished as swiftly as it came. Lucas reached him first, but Maigret was already kneeling, hand on the dying man's shoulder. Vasseur's breath rattled in his chest. In the end, he whispered, it's not the illness that kills, it's the men who believe they can control it. His eyes glazed over, and he was gone. The fountain continued to spill water, pink now under the pale light. Later, at the quay, Maigret stood by the window again, watching the rain begin. The city moved below him, unaware of the man who had just died for trying to erase its pain. Control. That was the illusion. Governments, scientists, even police, all chasing the same dream of mastery over what cannot be mastered. He tapped the ashes from his pipe and said quietly to the empty room, "And yet we keep trying." The fog thickened once more, swallowing the lamps until only their halos remained. Somewhere, in the wet hum of Paris, another mystery was already beginning to form. For the next 3 days, Paris seemed to hold its breath. The gunfire near the fountain had spread through the city like a fever dream, whispered about in cafes and stairwells, but never officially acknowledged. The papers mentioned only a scientific consultant found dead under mysterious circumstances. The ministry called it an isolated act. Maigret knew better. Nothing in Paris was ever isolated. The ripples always touched another shore. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the mood was heavy. The corridors smelled of tobacco and damp coats. Lucas sorted reports in silence while Janvier stood by the stove, rubbing his hands over the small coal fire. On Maigret's desk lay the latest autopsy report on Vasseur. 2 bullets to the chest, close range, no fingerprints, no witnesses. A single black thread had been found caught on the fountain's ironwork, possibly from a driver's glove. Useless, perhaps, but Maigret kept it anyway. Sometimes the smallest details carried the loudest truths. He leaned back in his chair, pipe smoke curling above him. Vasseur had spoken of others, men who saw profit where he saw regret. But who were they? Not politicians, not doctors. Those men left fingerprints of ambition. This was quieter, older, like a shadow that had always been there. When the telephone rang, it startled him. "Maigret," he said. A voice answered, gravelly, familiar. "This is Superintendent Arnoux from Tours. We've had another case, same symptoms, and something else. The victim was found, clutching a train ticket. Paris return." "What station?" "Gare d'Austerlitz, date stamped 2 days ago." By afternoon, Maigret was there. The station was a cathedral of steam and echoes. He stood among the departing trains, coat buttoned tight, hat pulled low. The air was thick with the scent of coal and the murmur of travellers. A porter led him to the baggage room where the victim's suitcase had been stored. It was unremarkable. Brown leather, initials AL pressed faintly on the side. Inside, clothes neatly folded, a shaving kit, a photograph of a woman standing beside a cafe window. Behind the photo, Maigret found a receipt from a chemist, Rue Saint-Honoré. Back in his car, he studied the receipt. The date matched the day before Vasseur's death. He could almost feel the faint pulse of connection threading through the paper. He told the driver to take him there immediately. The shop was clean, too clean. The shelves gleamed, each jar perfectly aligned. The man behind the counter wore a white coat and an expression that revealed nothing. "We're closed, monsieur," he said when Maigret entered. "Then you have time to talk," Maigret replied mildly, placing the receipt on the counter. "Recognize this?" The chemist's eyes flicked down, then up. A pause too long to be innocent. "Yes," he said finally. "I sold that to a gentleman. Tall grey coat, said it was for laboratory use." "What was it?" "A compound we prepare on request. Harmless on its own, combined with alcohol, perhaps less so." "And what was his name?" "He didn't give one." Maigret nodded. "Then I'll find it for you." Outside, he paused to light his pipe, the flame trembling in the wind. The street was quiet. Even the cafe opposite seemed muted. Yet as he exhaled, he saw movement in the reflection of the shop window, a man watching from across the street, hat brim low, cigarette glowing faintly. The moment their eyes met, the stranger turned and vanished into the alley. Maigret followed. His shoes struck the cobblestones in steady rhythm, echoing between the walls. The alley bent sharply to the right, ending in a courtyard of laundry lines and broken crates. Empty. But on the ground, beneath one of the lines, something gleamed. Another vial. He crouched, picked it up, and turned it in his fingers. Unlike the others, this one wasn't empty. A dark liquid clung to its sides, thick and slow. He held it to the light, and for a moment it seemed to shimmer, almost alive. Then he pocketed it carefully and walked back toward the street, feeling eyes that might still be watching. That night he worked late. The laboratory confirmed the contents before dawn, a compound derived from alkaloids fused with carbon extracts and a trace of something unidentifiable. "Whatever it is," the technician said, "it's not from any pharmacological catalogue. Whoever made it alone." Maigret stared at the vial under the lamp. The liquid caught the glow and threw it back in dull amber flashes. "Beneath the surface," he murmured. "That's where it all lived. The quiet laboratories, the closed rooms, the men who thought they could rewrite the rules of life." He leaned back, pipe forgotten, and listened to the city breathe through the open window. The fog had returned, heavier than before. Somewhere out there, beyond the bridge and the river, the rest of the pattern waited, unseen but close. He could feel it. And he knew, with the grim patience of a man who had spent his life listening to lies, that what lay beneath the surface would be far darker than what had already come to light. Morning arrived reluctantly, dragging its light through the fog like a weary traveller. The Seine lay still beneath its own reflection, and even the gulls circling above the bridges seemed to move more slowly, as if burdened by what the city had become. Paris had grown sick, not only with the mysterious illness, but with the quiet dread that it brought. People avoided eye contact in the streets. Cafe owners kept their radios turned down low. The city was listening to itself. Maigret walked through this silence like a man inside a dream. He had spent the night at the office, the vial still locked in his drawer. Every hour he had returned to it, as if expecting it to reveal its secret simply through persistence. But the liquid had remained stubbornly still, glinting faintly in the lamplight, a reminder of how far the mystery reached beneath the skin of things. When Lucas entered with the morning papers, Maigret barely looked up. "They've printed the chemist's name," Lucas said grimly. "Vasseur! Someone leaked it. They're calling him the plague doctor of Paris." Maigrey's jaw tightened. "And they think he acted alone." "They always do." He rose, pulling on his heavy overcoat. "Come," he said. "We're visiting someone who knows what lies beneath polite stories." Their destination was the Ministry of Health, a stone building with corridors too wide and walls that smelled faintly of old paper and wax. They were received by an undersecretary named Moreau, a man whose politeness was as crisp as his cuffs. "An unfortunate tragedy," Moreau said, shaking his head. "The man was unstable. We had no idea he was still active." "You had every idea," Maigrey said calmly, taking out his pipe but not lighting it. "Your ministry funded his work for 2 years and then erased his records when the results became inconvenient." Morel blinked, his smile stiffening. "Monsieur Maigrey, I don't know where you obtain such notions." "From your own archives," Maigrey interrupted. "We both know how many people die quietly for the sake of public image." The room fell still. Outside, the faint sound of typewriters echoed down the marble corridor. Morel finally spoke. "If you wish to keep your position, Inspector, you'll consider your words more carefully. Paris is nervous enough without rumors of government experiments." Maigrey leaned forward, eyes steady. "I don't deal in rumors, monsieur, only in facts. And the fact is, your ministry tried to erase pain, and instead created despair." When they left the building, Lucas exhaled hard. "You think he'll have you transferred for that?" Maigrey shrugged. "He might, but I've been transferred before." They walked toward the river, neither speaking for several minutes. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of damp stone. At the Pont Saint-Michel, Maigrey stopped and stared at the water below. "Do you know what I hate most about this city, Lucas?" he said quietly. "It forgives too easily. Men like Morel sleep well while others die of their forgiveness." Back at the quay, a telegram awaited him, unsigned, typed in block letters. "Stop digging or you'll end up like him." No address, no sender. Maigrey read it once, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Warnings meant you were getting close. That evening he went alone to Rue Saint-Honoré, where the chemist's shop had stood. It was closed now, shutters drawn. The faint smell of alcohol and oil lingered in the cracks of the doorframe. He walked around to the alley and found a side entrance, unlatched. Inside, the shop was dark except for a single hanging bulb that buzzed faintly. Shelves lined the walls, and the floor was littered with broken glass and discarded papers. On the counter lay an open ledger. The last entries were recent, lists of substances, coded initials beside each, and beneath them one familiar name, A.L., the initials from the suitcase at Austerlitz. Maigrey's pulse quickened. He turned the page blank, then another. The next contained a short, handwritten note. The others know. "It spreads through the air, not the blood." He froze. For a moment, the silence in the shop grew heavy, almost alive. Then a floorboard creaked behind him. He turned, but saw only shadow. "Who's there?" he said sharply. No answer. The bulb flickered once, then went out. He moved toward the door, hand on his revolver. A faint rustle, the sound of a coat brushing against wood. Then, before his eyes adjusted, a voice, low, measured, almost kind. "You're closer than you should be, Maigrey." He didn't recognize it. "Who are you?" "A friend of Vasseur's once," but he forgot who his friends were. The next sound was the click of a latch. A flash of movement, a door slamming shut. By the time he reached the street, the alley was empty. He stood there for a long time, the fog thick around him, the city quiet as a held breath. Somewhere in the distance, A church bell tolled 9. He knew then that this was no longer about a single scientist or a string of victims. It was about something older, a hunger for control that had slipped its leash, spreading like the illness itself, invisible but everywhere. As he walked back to the river, he took the vial from his pocket, holding it to the lamplight. The liquid inside shivered faintly, catching the glow in thin ribbons of gold and black. "A darker truth," he murmured. "Always darker." He closed his fist around it, the glass warm against his palm. Paris slept uneasily behind him, unaware of how close it stood to waking into something far worse. The dawn broke colourless over Paris, the kind of pale morning that made the city look older than it was. The fog, reluctant to leave, clung to the rooftops and bridges like memory refusing to fade. Maigret sat by the window of his small office, watching the first carts rumble down the quay, their wheels hissing against wet cobblestones. He had not gone home. The smell of stale tobacco and rain hung over the room. The vial lay before him, catching the dim light like an unspoken accusation. He had spent the night turning over names, faces, fragments. Vasseur, the chemist, the man in the alley, the nameless victims. And beneath them all, the faint shape of something older, something that stretched far beyond this outbreak. He opened the ledger again, tracing his finger across the initials A.L. The letters stirred a faint memory. He searched through the drawers until he found it, an old file from a case nearly 15 years past. Armand Lenoir, a biologist once associated with Vasseur at the Sorbonne, dismissed after an internal scandal. The file was thin, rumours of theft, whispered allegations of unethical trials, nothing proven, nothing closed. Maigret had forgotten the name until now. By midday, he was at the university archives, where the dust lay thick and the silence heavier than the air. The clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, brought him the requested box with reluctant care. Inside were letters, correspondence between Vasseur and Lenoir dated before the war. Most were dry, technical, but one, written in hurried script, caught his attention. "If the mind forgets pain, what remains of the man? You're playing with ghosts, Armand. Some things must not be perfected." It was signed by Vasseur himself. That evening, Maigret took a slow walk through the Latin Quarter, pipe in hand, coat collar turned up. The lamps flickered in the mist, and from the open doors of cafes came the faint sound of an accordion. Students laughed, lovers whispered, and somewhere a violin cried softly. Yet beneath it all was a hum, low and uneasy, the murmur of a city beginning to suspect its own reflection. He found what he was looking for on Rue des Écoles, an apartment block with peeling shutters and a tarnished brass plate. Dr. Armand Lenoir, consultant in physiological studies. The concierge was suspicious, but not unkind. "He keeps odd hours, that one," she said. "Quiet as a cat, but always watching. You'll find him upstairs, last door on the left." The stairwell smelled of damp plaster and pipe smoke. Maigret knocked once. The door opened a fraction, held by a chain. A pair of eyes regarded him calmly, grey, steady, without surprise. "Inspector Maigret," Lenoir said, unfastening the chain. "I wondered how long it would take you." The apartment was dim, the curtains drawn tight. Books lined every wall, instruments and glassware occupied every surface. The air shimmered faintly with the odour of chemicals. "You knew Vasseur?" Maigret began. "Knew him?" "Yes, I taught him." "And after the ministry closed your work?" Lenoir smiled faintly. "I continued, as all honest men do, and taught it in private. The world has no patience for truth, Inspector. It prefers comfort." Maigret looked around the room. On a nearby table lay several vials identical to the one he carried, each labelled with numbers, not names. You created it, he said quietly. I refined it, Lenoir corrected. Vasseur was a visionary, but too sentimental. He wanted to heal pain. I wanted to understand it. He moved closer, his tone calm, almost academic. Do you know what suffering is, Inspector? A signal, a message from the body to the soul. Remove that signal and what remains? A shell that breathes but no longer feels. I gave humanity the means to silence its pain, and in doing so I showed it how little life means without it. Maigret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. And the illness. A byproduct, Lenoir said with a shrug. The body resists peace. It dies rather than live without memory. That's the price of being human. You're killing people. I'm revealing them, Lenoir said softly. Removing their illusions. The illusion of control, of compassion, of justice. Even you, Maigret. You think you can hold the city together with questions and pity, but the city doesn't want truth. It wants sleep. The inspector's hand tightened around his pipe. Then you'll let it rest, he said. Lenoir sighed, looking almost weary. You can't arrest what isn't a crime yet. There are others now, men with more money and fewer scruples. Even if you stop me, you won't stop what they've begun. He picked up one of the vials, holding it between finger and thumb. This is only the beginning, Inspector. Paris is the experiment. The world is the patient. Maigret stepped forward. Put it down. Lenoir smiled, and did. The glass hit the floor and shattered. A faint vapor hissed upward, vanishing almost instantly. When Maigret looked up again, the man was gone. He ran into the corridor, down the stairs, out into the street. But the fog had thickened, swallowing everything beyond a few meters. Only the echo of footsteps remained, fading into the night. He stood there for a long while, chest heaving, the air around him tasting faintly metallic. Behind him, the windows of Lenoir's apartment were dark. He knew he would not see him again, not tonight, perhaps not ever. Men like that did not hide. They simply vanished, waiting until the world caught up with them. As he walked back toward the river, Maigret's thoughts were heavy. The long shadow of the past had finally reached him, stretching across years, across lives, across every quiet compromise that had let such men thrive. And in its darkness, he understood something bitter. This had never been a story of science. It was a story of belief, the belief that human suffering could be managed like numbers on a page. He paused on the bridge, watching the water shift beneath him. The Seine carried the reflection of the lamps in trembling chains of gold, broken and rejoined by the current. So it always ends, he murmured, in the river. The fog closed in again, and the city exhaled. Somewhere in the depths below, unseen, the shadow moved on. The fog did not lift for 3 days. It hung over the city like a shroud, turning every street lamp into a halo and every figure into a ghost. Paris seemed to be waiting for something. An announcement, a confession, a reckoning. But nothing came. The government said little. The newspapers printed less. Only the police at the Quai des Orfèvres moved with purpose, tracing invisible threads through the silence. Maigret had barely slept. His desk was buried in reports, letters, sketches of faces, and maps threaded with red pencil lines. Lucas and Janvier came and went in weary shifts. They had found traces of Lenoir's movements, train tickets, coded telegrams, chemical orders under false names. He had built not a laboratory, but a network. The illness, the deaths, even the fear, all were part of something larger, and at its center was not one man, but many. In the late afternoon, a messenger arrived carrying a sealed envelope marked confidential. Inside was a note from the prefecture. Cease all inquiries into the Saint-Honoré matter. The investigation is to be transferred to internal affairs. Maigret read it twice, then folded it neatly. Internal affairs, he muttered, which means buried affairs. He slipped the letter into a drawer and locked it. We continue. By evening, he and Lucas were walking through the Marais, their footsteps echoing on wet stones. The district was quieter now, the shops shuttered early. Maigret's breath misted before him as he spoke. Vasseur was silenced. Lenoir vanished. Whoever's behind this still walks free, unprotected. Lucas hesitated. You think it's coming from above? Maigret smiled faintly. Above? Below? What does it matter? The filth rises to the same level in the end. They reached a narrow street lined with shuttered apothecaries and clockmakers. A single light burned behind frosted glass, a sign that read Maison d'Essais Médicaux. The building wasn't listed in any official record, but the address had appeared twice in Lenoir's correspondence. Maigret pushed open the door. Inside, the air smelled of ether and dust. Shelves of instruments lined the walls, and rows of sealed crates filled the floor. A young clerk looked up from a ledger, startled. We're closed. I'm sure you are, Maigret said. Show me the back room. The boy hesitated. Maigret's expression did not change. A moment later, they were walking down a short corridor into a chamber lit by a single gas lamp. The space was clinical, too clean, too ordered. Along one wall stood half a dozen glass tanks filled with colourless fluid. Floating inside each, suspended like relics, were vials identical to the one Maigret carried. What is this place? Lucas whispered. The clerk's voice trembled. We're conducting preservation tests. The ministry... Which ministry? Maigret snapped. I don't know, monsieur. The orders come through intermediaries. Maigret leaned closer to one of the tanks. Inside, faint letters had been etched on each vial. L1, L2, L3, the Lenoir series. He felt a chill settle into his bones. This was not an experiment abandoned. It was one continuing in silence. When they left the building, he ordered Lucas to seal it and post guards, though he knew the order would be countermanded before dawn. Someone higher would intervene, and the crates would vanish as if they had never existed. But for tonight, at least, truth had been seen. That night, Maigret returned home for the first time in days. Madame Maigret met him at the door, her eyes soft with worry. You look ill, she said quietly. I'm only tired. She set a plate of stew before him, though he barely tasted it. Whatever this case is, she said after a long silence, promise me you'll leave it when it's done. He looked at her, the weight of years between them heavy but kind. It's never done, he said gently. Not in this city. Later, as she slept, he sat in the kitchen with a single lamp burning, writing in his notebook. His notes had become more than an investigation now. They were a confession, a record of everything the city would soon forget. The web stretched everywhere. Scientists, officials, financiers, each linked by quiet transactions and shared interests. They called it progress, but it was closer to blasphemy. At 3 a.m, he stopped writing. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. From the street below came the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. He rose, moved to the window and looked out. A man stood across the street beneath the lamplight, face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He did not move, did not smoke, did not signal. He simply stood, watching. Maigret watched back. After a moment, the figure turned and disappeared into the mist. He sat again, staring at the empty street. The web, he realized, was not only of lies and power, it was also of eyes, unseen, unblinking, waiting. In Paris, nothing ever truly vanished. It only went deeper underground, waiting for men like him to stumble upon it once more. He closed his notebook and whispered to the dark, "Sooner or later, every secret returns." The clock struck 4. The fog pressed against the windowpane, dense and endless. Somewhere in the city, the machinery of deceit kept turning, quiet and smooth. But for the first time, Maigret felt its rhythm falter. Just slightly, as if it knew he was listening. The fog broke at last, but only to reveal a city that looked no cleaner for its sunlight. Paris gleamed with that deceptive brightness that comes after rain, when every street looks scrubbed and every puddle hides the depth of something unseen. The Seine glinted like metal under the morning sky. On the bridges, people moved quietly, their eyes avoiding one another's. The fear had not vanished, it had simply learned to walk in daylight. Maigret stood outside the prefecture, lighting his pipe with a hand that trembled only slightly. The note from Internal Affairs still lay folded in his coat pocket, its words like lead against his heart. He knew they would come for him soon, perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but they would. Too many names had passed his lips, too many stones had been turned over. Paris forgave many things, but not curiosity. When Lucas arrived, his face was grave. "We've traced the money, Chief. The accounts Vasseur used to buy his supplies, all funneled through a bank on Boulevard Haussmann. The records show a patron." Maigret nodded. "Who?" Lucas hesitated. "A name that appears often in the ministry's correspondence, Jean-Paul Morel." The inspector smiled without warmth. So the circle closes. By midday, they were standing outside Morel's townhouse, a grand building with iron gates and a garden that smelled faintly of lilacs and coal. A servant opened the door, pale and tight-lipped. "Monsieur Morel is not receiving visitors." "He will receive us," Maigret said. And before the man could object, he stepped inside. The drawing-room was immaculate, its silence broken only by the ticking of a clock. Morel appeared from the far doorway, still wearing the mask of bureaucratic calm. "Inspector, I had a feeling you would ignore my instructions." "I ignore most bad advice," Maigret said. They faced each other in the golden light. Outside, the carriages moved like distant ghosts. "You were funding Vasseur's experiments," Maigret said. "When it failed, you found Lenoir to continue the work, and now you've turned it into something else, something you can sell." Morel smiled faintly. "You have imagination, Inspector, but you mistake the world. We are past the age of moral outrage. Do you think progress waits for permission? Pain is currency. People will pay to forget it. And those who die? Collateral. Paris feeds on itself. It always has." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Maigret studied him, the sheen of his cufflinks, the slight tremor in his right hand, the kind of confidence that comes only from thinking oneself untouchable. Then he said quietly, "You should have stayed in your office, Monsieur Morel. Paper lies better than men do." The silence cracked. Lucas stepped forward, placing a folder on the desk. Signed receipts, ministry authorizations, private accounts, all bearing your signature. Morel's composure faltered for the first time. "You wouldn't dare—" "Arrest you!" Maigret interrupted. "Not at all. I'll simply make sure the press prints everything before dawn. Paris will do the rest." Morel's face paled, but his voice steadied. "You don't understand, Maigret. This is bigger than me, bigger than any of us. You think you've found a man, but you've only found a door. Beyond it, there are others. Men with power you cannot imagine." "Then they'll wait their turn," Maigret said. He turned to leave. Lucas followed. But before they reached the threshold, Morel's voice stopped them. "Be careful, Inspector. Every man who drags the truth into daylight ends up buried in the shade." Outside, the sun was setting behind the rooftops, staining the sky with the color of rust. The city seemed to breathe again, unaware of the quiet war that had just taken place in one of its finest homes. That night, Maigret returned to the quay. He dictated his report in long, steady sentences, each word deliberate. The lamps flickered and the room smelled of ink and tobacco. When he was done, he sealed the file with wax and placed it in the vault. "If they want silence," he murmured, "they'll have to earn it." But as he reached for his hat, Lucas appeared in the doorway, face pale. "Chief, there's been an explosion." "Where?" "Boulevard Haussmann." They ran. The night sky pulsed orange as they approached, the ministry building engulfed in flame. Firemen shouted, hoses hissed, crowds gathered. Somewhere inside, the upper floors had collapsed. Maigret stood motionless, the heat on his face, the smoke biting at his eyes, the records, the evidence, everything gone. Beside him, Lucas whispered, "It's over." Maigret shook his head slowly. "No, Lucas, it's only begun." Because even as the flames rose higher, Maigret saw them for what they were, not destruction, but purification. Someone was cleaning the slate, erasing the stains before they could be read. He watched the building crumble, thinking of Lenoir, of Vasseur, of Morel's final words. The web was burning, yes, but spiders always rebuilt. He turned away, the light of the fire flickering in his eyes. "Get me the morning editions," he said, "before they're rewritten." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke toward the river. Maigret stood there a moment longer, then dropped his pipe into the gutter. The flame hissed out instantly. Above the rooftops, the bell of Saint-Roch began to toll the hour. Midnight. The countdown had ended, but not the story. The morning after the fire, the city was veiled in a thin, metallic haze. The air smelled faintly of smoke and rain, and above the Seine, the sky held the grey stillness of aftermath. Crowds gathered near the ruins of the ministry, staring at the blackened skeleton of the building as though it might speak. It didn't. Paris had seen too many tragedies to linger long on one more. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat at his desk with his hat still on, his coat unbuttoned, his eyes fixed on nothing. The case file lay open before him, the pages singed at the edges from the night's heat. Lucas and Janvier were silent. Even the typewriters in the next room seemed hesitant to break the quiet. "It's gone," Lucas said at last, his voice low. "Every document, every signature. Morel's dead. They found him near the cellar stairs, burned beyond recognition." Maigret nodded slowly. "The perfect ending," he murmured. "A villain destroyed by his own fire. Paris will sleep easier tonight." "Will you?" Janvier asked quietly. Maigret's pipe clicked against his teeth, unlit. "No," he said, "because I don't believe in perfect endings." He rose and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had begun again, fine and cold. Across the street, a woman hurried by beneath an umbrella, her heels tapping on the stones. Life was returning already, indifferent and inevitable. That was the city's gift and its curse. In the afternoon, a courier arrived with an envelope. No seal, no address, only Maigret's name in careful black ink. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore the words, "Truth burns slow." A.L. He folded it once, twice, then placed it into his coat pocket. The initials could only belong to one man. Lenoir lived. Somewhere beyond the ashes and the silence, the architect of the illness still moved, perhaps even watching. By dusk, Maigret found himself walking without plan or direction, his steps guided by habit more than intent. The streets were slick, the lamps haloed by mist. He crossed the Pont Neuf and paused midway, looking down at the water. The current was swollen, restless, carrying debris from the night's storm, twigs, a newspaper, a child's wooden toy. The Seine never judged. It only carried. A memory surfaced, Vasseur's dying words at the fountain. It's not the illness that kills. It's the men who believe they can control it. How easily those words could have been Lenoir's, or Morel's, or his own, if he were honest. Control was the disease, not the cure. Every man infected by it paid in the same currency: loneliness, ruin, and silence. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Commissaire?" He turned. A girl stood by the railing, a journalist he'd seen before at press briefings. Her notebook was tucked under one arm, her expression half apologetic, half defiant. "They say the ministry's files were destroyed," she said. "That the sickness was nothing more than rumour." "They say many things," Maigret replied. "Then tell me the truth." He looked at her for a long moment. "The truth," he said finally, "is what Paris believes after midnight. Tomorrow it will believe something else." She frowned, unsure if he was mocking her. But he wasn't. He was tired. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her with her empty page. Back home, Madame Maigret had left a light burning in the kitchen. The smell of soup filled the air. She greeted him with quiet relief, though she said nothing. He hung his coat, washed his hands, and sat opposite her. For a while they ate in silence. Then she said softly, "It's finished?" Maigret shook his head. "No, but it's sleeping now like everything else in Paris." Later he sat by the window, pipe lit at last, watching the smoke drift toward the ceiling. Outside the rain had turned to mist again, soft and unending. Somewhere a siren wailed faintly, then faded. He thought of the people who had died, the bookseller, the widow, the student, and how easily their names would be forgotten once the city found a new story to tell. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the folded note. "Truth burns slow." He looked at it for a long time, then held it to the flame of his pipe. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished. When the last ash fell into the tray, he leaned back and closed his eyes. For once, there was no sound in the room but the steady rhythm of the rain. In the morning, the streets would be washed clean, and the world would pretend nothing had happened. That was how Paris survived, by forgetting just enough to keep breathing. And Maigret, who had seen more truth than any man should, understood that forgetting was its own kind of mercy. He smiled faintly, almost sadly, and said to the empty room, "We'll meet again, old friend. The city never forgets forever." The rain answered softly against the glass. The lamplight flickered, and in the quiet heart of the Quai des Orfèvres, the last ember of the case glowed once, then went out.